There are a lot of legendaries in the Pokemon franchise, so I think it's useful to categorize them in groups. Some legendary Pokemon are specifically designed to be incredibly overpowered, and the Pokemon Company is aware of this, so they put restrictions on the usage of these legendaries. In official VGC events, many of these legendaries are outright banned from being used, and if they are available to use, there are restrictions, like only being able to use 1 or 2 of them on a team maximum. These restricted legendaries are in their own category and are clearly on a higher power level. But some legendary Pokemon have no restrictions associated with them. You can use as many of them as you like in official tournaments, and in competitive singles, most of them are also completely legal to use. Cerebi.net defines this group of legendaries as sub-legendary Pokemon, and these sub-legendaries can vary greatly in their power level. Some of them are pretty terrible, never seeing any usage at all in VGC, and being ranked in lower tiers of competitive singles too. But some of them are competitive staples, constantly seen in high-level play, and in competitive singles some of them are even banned from use for being too powerful. Some groups of players, especially those of high intelligence, consider Muck to be a sub-legendary Pokemon, but only on Mondays. Let's go ahead and rank every single one of these sub-legendaries, from worst to best. Subscribe to the channel for your own self-interest. Thank you. At the very bottom of the list, folks, we have Kubfu, who isn't even fully evolved. Some legendaries do have evolutions. This is a relatively recent idea, but Kubfu evolves into Urshifu, who is very good, but obviously the pre-evolved form, while technically a legendary, is not powerful. It has no stats. It's got the ability Inner Focus, pretty useless, and a simple mono-fighting typing. Visual design is very cool though. Nobody really talks about this Pokemon because it has no relevance anywhere, but visually, I gotta say it's got some personality going on. It's a fighting bear. I appreciate that. I appreciate this, and I would give it some respect for that. Up next we have Poipole, who evolves into Naganadel. Interesting that a single Ultra Beast has a pre-evolved form and none of the other ones do, but that's the reality. It's a mono-poison type. It's got Beast Boost on it, which is better than what Kubfu has, so I suppose that's slightly better, but it has no relevance anywhere. Visual design, though, is cool. It looks like it has an alien helmet, and I like its name. It sounds like a child attempting to say the word purple. Poipole has some creative value, but no competitive value. Up next we have Type Null, who is also a first stage evolution of a legendary. And this one actually does have a competitive set. It can use the Eviolite item because it's not fully evolved, granting it extra bulk. Its stats are a bit better than the other not fully evolved legendaries, and it has U-turn on it, which means it can pivot. This set right here is pretty simple. Rest Talk with U-turn and Toxic, but decent defensive pivot in Gen 8 ZU. A very low power level format, but that's something. That is something. Let's go Type Null. You've got a small amount of value. The Pokemon that Type Null evolves into is Silvally, who happens to be right next on the list. Silvally is kind of like Arceus Jr. It has the Arceus System ability, which allows it to change its type based on what memory item it's holding. So Fairy Memory will turn it into a Fairy type. It will also change the type of the multi-attack move. But Silvally is significantly worse than Arceus is, with way lower stats, a more limited move pool, and less to offer overall. In fact, it's one of the worst legendaries in the whole series. Ranked all the way down in the ZU tier in Generation 8 and not even present in Generation 9. Up next is Regice, a Pokemon that is well known as one of the worst legendaries in the series. Regice has the terrible ability Slow Start, which exists as a deliberate drawback, but unfortunately it's a bit too much of a drawback, and Regice has never really been functional as a competitive Pokemon because of this. Slow Start causes Regice to have halved attack and speed for 5 turns when it switches in, so you have to wait 5 turns to be able to actually make good use of Regice. And 5 turns is a very long time. That's a lot to ask, waiting 5 turns to activate this Pokemon's full potential. It's got good defensive stats though, so you could maybe use it as just a wall without worrying about its attack or speed, but unfortunately its move pool is very limited. Compared to other bulky normal types like Blissey, you don't have good healing options or progress making moves or utility moves. that help your team. This guy came out all the way back in Gen 4, and it's one of the worst debuts for a legendary ever. It was NU in its debut game, and it's just never been good. It's never been very good, unfortunately. Cool concept, but not functional competitively. In doubles, you can pair Regice with Wheezing, who has neutralizing gas, to remove all of the abilities on the field, and without an ability, Regice doesn't have slow start, and it can use its attack, but that's a lot to ask. It's a lot of setup, bit of a gimmick strategy with varying degrees of success. Now, this might be a controversial placement, but I'm going to go ahead and put Glastria as low as this point in the list here. Glastria debuted in Generation 8, where it was immediately terrible. And in a vacuum, you could say Glastria is better than some other Pokemon on this list, but considering that this is a Gen 8 Pokemon designed for Gen 8, it missed the mark completely, especially as a legendary. I can understand if a legendary that was released back in Gen 2 sucks in Gen 8 and is ranked in the lower tiers, but this guy debuted in Gen 8 and immediately failed to really achieve much. This Pokemon is a mono ice type, which is already a death sentence, and it has the incredibly low speed of only 30. Its stats elsewhere are excellent, but just being a slow ice type is an incredibly hard feat to overcome. It has Chilling Neigh, which is basically Moxie with a different name. Yeah, debuted in ZUBL in Gen 8, and it's ZU ranked as well in Gen 9. So I would have to say Glastria, one of the worst legendaries in the series. The best way to use this is probably on Trick Room teams, where you can turn that incredibly low speed into an advantage, but then it still has the issue of its horrendous defensive typing, making it hard to bring it into the field, and also Trick Room sucks in singles. In doubles, maybe this could work, but even then, I think there are better slow threats that aren't ice types. You know, being ice type is just so bad, folks. It's just terrible. There's also a bit of dissonance, I think, between how this thing looks and its speed stat. I feel like this looks like it could gallop through the field very quickly. It looks nimble and quick, and yet its speed stat is only 30. I might to imagine this like trotting along at a snail's pace. What purpose would it serve then? As a horse, I'm supposed to ride the horse, but then I could walk faster myself. I would give myself, 50 base speed if I were a Pokemon? I don't know if Glastria has much out-of-battle utility either, with only 30 speed. Pathetic. Absolutely pathetic. Up next is Guzzlord, and this Pokemon is just a disaster. I mean, come on. Visually, this is an absolute dog's breakfast. What am I looking at? It's got crab claws, it's a giant mouth. It's a mess. It is a mess. Dark Dragon typing, pretty cool, but very slow Pokemon. Times 4 weak to Fairy, weak to Fighting as well. The Fairy weakness is the most damning thing defensively. It's got Beast Boost, but then what is it really boosting up? It has enormous HP and average everything else, and not very good utility, like it doesn't have a recovery move. Doesn't really know what it's trying to be. Is it trying to be an offensive threat? I mean, it doesn't even have any attack. It's got 100 attack. You're supposed to be a wall. Where's your utility moves? Where is your utility moves? Where's your good typing? It's not there. Beast Boost, you're going to boost your attack, I guess. It's your highest stat. You could maybe... You did 53 defense and special defense. Pathetic. 43 speed. This is a Pokemon that is just pure chaos. What is it trying to do? Who is it for? It debuted in Gen 7, where it was immediately ranked in the PUBL tier, and that is a very embarrassing debut for a Gen 7 legendary beast. Some of its peers are incredibly powerful, Kartana being one of them. A staple of competitive gaming, and yet Guzzlord over here is not even on the level. He thinks he's part of the team, and this is a terrible Pokemon. It's a terrible Pokemon. There's nothing more to say. Up next is Regice, who you probably all thought was lower than this, right? Regice is also infamous as one of the worst legendaries, but it actually wasn't bad in its debut game, so I'd give it some respect for that. When it was designed, it functioned, and that's an important factor, I think, to consider, because most Pokemon are designed for the game they debut in, and they get worse over time, usually. That's how things work. But I subtract points from a Pokemon that sucks in its debut game, because it proves that they weren't really considering the design of the Pokemon in the generation it exists within. Regice, however, in Gen 3 there's no Stealth Rock yet. Mono Ice typing is not completely unviable like it becomes later. And Regice had many years of being ranked in OU, which is impressive for a defensive Ice type. That doesn't happen these days. Regice was ranked OU for a long time. With an incredible special defense stat, this was a functional Pokemon because pre-physical special split as well. The only type that could hit Regice super effectively on the special side was actually fire. There were no fighting type special attacks yet, so Regice withstands special hits from just about any special attacker that isn't a fire type. And it's more aggressive than something like Blissey. because it has the stab ice beam, it's got explosion. It's a good option on teams that want a special switch in, but also want a bit of aggression. I think it's a great Pokemon, actually, even to this day. Even though it's ranked UUBL now, it's seen pretty consistently in tournaments by some of the best players in the game, and I really like it. I quite like it. But we also have to be honest and say that Regice from Gen 4 onwards was absolutely horrendous and pretty much totally unviable. As Stealth Rock was introduced, higher base power attacks that threaten it were introduced, the Steel type became better. Being a Mono Ice type defensively is just not an option. It simply doesn't work. And Regice has little to keep up with the growing anti-Ice type sentiment, so that's rough for it, isn't it? But it did have its time once. Speaking of Gen 3 competitive, if you want to see some Gen 3 tournament gameplay, check out Revival Tournaments, a side channel run by myself and some colleagues where we cover Pokemon tournaments, and we're currently hosting ADV Revival 2. Check it out. Up next is Mesprit, one of the more unimpressive legendaries in terms of its overall competitive career, but at least in its debut game it was decent. It's ranked in UU, where it is an okay Pokemon. It's got that Psychic typing, which wasn't bad yet. It wasn't that bad yet. It's got Levitate, always good, and it's got a vast move pool with, pivoting, status. It's got Stealth Rock, which is always good. It's got like Trick, Healing Wish, which are good on Choice Scarf sets. It can be used in OU apparently because of its superior bulk compared to like Azelf, and maybe some merit over Uxie, who is also used sometimes. So that's alright, but in just about every other generation it is terrible, especially Gen 6 onwards when Mono Psychic typing just became really bad as Dark and Ghost types were on the rise. But Mesprit at least didn't have the worst debut in the world for a legendary, so there you go. Up next, Articuno. Now, Articuno had a similar fate to Regice post-Gen 4, where Gen 4 killed a lot of Pokemon, Articuno included. Articuno had it even worse because it's ×4 weak to Rock, which is just an absolute death sentence in every way. But before that, Articuno was pretty good, especially in Gen 1 when it was first introduced. It's not OU ranked, but I think it's quite a good Pokemon in Gen 1 OU, where it has the powerful Stab Blizzard. Blizzard was a much better move back then. Ice typing was actually good in Gen 1 because it offers freeze immunity and nothing can threaten it really. There's not that many rock or fighting type attacks in the game to speak of. And Articuno also had a high special stat back then, meaning it hits even harder. In Gen 3, Articuno was also reasonably good. It has a UUBL rating. It is a viable choice on certain kinds of defensive teams in Gen 3. It offers security against enemy offensive water types. It has Heal Bell, which not many Pokemon have, and Stealth Rocks don't exist, so it's not completely disallowed from existence. But yeah, Articuno from Gen 4 onwards is, of course, one of the worst legendaries in the game, and it's completely non-functional in competitive singles. Articuno did have that brief stint of doubles viability, though, I believe, with the Snow Cloak set that it could abuse evasion. Kind of lame, but still a point of viability for Articuno there. So there you go. Up next, we've got Regirock, who also had a decent debut, not as good as Regice, but a decent debut in the UUBL tier in Gen 3. It has a place in OU as a reasonably good bulky attacker, seen a decent amount in competitive play. As the years have gone on though, it had more of a slow decline than Regice did, but Regice immediately became terrible as soon as rocks were in the mix. Regirock could at least do stuff in, the mid to low tiers over the years, but in the modern day it's just been left behind by, power creep, better options available, and it is one of the worst legendary Pokemon in the game by today's standards. Up next is Virizion. Virizion had a decent debut in Gen 5, ranked in UU, but a little underwhelming for a legendary, I'd say. A Gen 5 legendary, part of a cool new quartet. It's definitely the worst of the bunch in Gen 5, and when you look at its stat distribution alone, you wouldn't think this is a legendary Pokemon. It's got a pretty average stat distribution here. High special defense is a strange choice as well on a Pokemon that seems designed to function offensively with its move pool and typing. Its offensive stats are rather weak actually, but it can get by in Gen 5 based on its move pool, which is pretty good for the time. In the modern day though, Virizion is not the best. And in Gen 9 it's ranked all the way down in ZU. What a fall from grace for Virizion. Unfortunate. Up next is an unfortunate one, folks. It pains me because I like this Pokemon. I think it's a nice design. I think it's the best of its legendary group in terms of creative visual design, but it's just the truth, folks. It's just the truth of it. Wo-Chien is a bad legendary. It is a significantly worse Pokemon than all of its counterparts in the Ruinous Quartet, and it's ranked all the way down in PU and competitive singles. I think it had some merit in VGC, but I don't know. Moxie Boosted can tell you for a fact that bringing Wo-Chien to Worlds was a huge mistake. And if Wo-Chien's strongest soldier says so, then what could I possibly say in the snail's defense? This is a dark grass type Pokemon, seemingly trying to be a utility defensive sort of Pokemon. It's got access to Leech Seed, Knockoff, good moves, progress making. Foul Play lets it hit physical attackers as well. It's got the Tablets of Ruin ability, which lowers the attack stat of everything on the field, except itself, and its stats are pretty good. It's got good defensive stats, but Dark Grass typing is just so terrible. It's ×4 bug weak, which is terrible in Gen 9, terrible all around really, because you're weak to U-turn, the most common pivoting move, and any bug coverage, of course. You're weak to fighting, it's a common type. You're weak to ice and fire, you're weak to fairy. For a defensive Pokemon, to be weak to so many things is not good. It's not good. You want to be weak to little things if you're defensive, right? Wo-Chien lacks healing moves. It lacks much to offer. I mean, so many things just have the same tools but are better and more functional than Wo-Chien. It's terrible. I hate to be a Wo-Chien hater, but this snail is unable to keep up with the fast-moving times, unfortunately. Up next is Monkey Dory, and this does not even look like a legendary to me. If you showed me an image of this, I would think it's a random Pokemon from the mid-game that you would see alongside a Passimian in the jungle area of the Pokemon video game. He's got special attack on him. He's got 130 base special attack. A base 106 speed is okay, and it has a poison psychic typing with some stab options. It can pivot. It's got the ability Toxic Chain, which has 30% chance to inflict toxic poison on all of its moves. That's very good, especially with U-turn. That's a safe way to just inflict poison on things. But as a special attacker, I mean, there are so many better options. Dragapult, Raging Bolt, I don't even know, just name anything off the top of your head is probably more desirable than Monkey Dory. Poison Psychic is rough. So many weaknesses. One of the best Pokemon in OU is Poison Psychic, Galarian Slowking, but that Pokemon has a lot of good utility and the ability Regenerator to make up for the typing. So Monkey Dory doesn't have the same defensive switch-in potential as Galarian Slowking. It's got little in the way of longevity. It's a struggle to even exist as this monkey. It's debuted in Gen 9 and it's ranked all the way down in NU, which is not a very strong debut. At all. Not at all. Up next is Stakataka, which is a Pokemon that I always hate to say out loud. Stakataka. Thank you. Stakataka is a Pokemon, it's one of the Ultra Beasts, folks. It certainly is. And it's got the ability Beast Boost, granting it a stat raise on KO. This is an interesting one. It's got an excellent attack and defense. Serviceable special defense as well, but negative speed, 13 base speed, but that's the whole thing. It's a Trick Room Pokemon. It's supposed to do that. And in doubles, this Pokemon was quite good, actually. This is one of the things that could withstand Xerneas. You, of course, resist Fairy. You hit them with the big Gyro Ball, which is super effective damage. It's a pretty effective anti-Xerneas gaming Pokemon. It, of course, has the Rock Steel typing, though, and in singles, it's absolutely horrendous. It's non-functional. As Trick Room is bad, the typing is bad, but in doubles, it's a reasonably good Pokemon, so it deserves some respect for that. Up next is Registeel. This Pokemon, with its Mono Steel typing, has the best defensive typing of the Regi trio, the original Regi trio. And with its good move pool, solid defensive stats in both areas, and new options over the years like Body Press and stuff like this, Registeel has aged better than the other two Regis. At least not being ranked at the absolute lowest possible tier in the game. It's NU in Gen 9, and just back in Gen 8 it was RU. I think it also had some VGC viability recently. So yeah, some respect to Registeel for all of that. Thank you to Registeel. Up next is Uxie, who had quite a good debut actually. Uxie is pretty useful compared to the other two of its legendary trio because of its excellent defensive stats. Sets itself apart from Azelf in that department and is reasonably good in OU actually. Even though it's officially ranked in UU, it is seen in Gen 4 OU competitive play quite a bit for its access to hazards, utility like Thunder Wave, U-turn to pivot out, and it's common on Rain Dance teams as well, as just a bulky Rain setter that can then pivot out to a Swift Swim Pokemon in Gen 4 OU. That's a pretty good strategy. So Uxie has a respectable debut, and in most generations it's not ranked at the very bottom, it's like RU over the years, so a reasonably okay legendary compared to some of the worst ones, but still not very good. Up next is Regidrago, who I have to say, great visual design. Fantastic visual design. I love that the arms are like a dragon head. It looks very cool. It's got an inspiration. There was a spark of inspiration when they made this, and I think they were trying to do something interesting with it. It's got the ability Dragon's Maw, which does a lot of dragon type damage basically. Unfortunately, Regidrago is completely blanked by fairy types pretty much. It's got earth power at least to hit steels, which you do want to hit because steel resists dragon, but against fairy types your best option is Terra type steel Terra Blast here, which is not fantastic news for Regidrago. So for this guy to function, it's got to eliminate fairy types from the mix, and fairy types are extremely common, of course. For that reason, it's very limited in what it can actually achieve in competitive singles. If you play the TCG though, this is one of the best cards in the game, in the Pokemon trading card game. It's got the Apex Dragon attack, which can of course deal the attack of any dragon type in your discard pile. Did you know this? I knew it. You didn't know it. You can use the Dragapult EX attack, Phantom Dive, to spread damage counters on the enemy's bench. You didn't know it. I knew all about it. I knew all about that. Yeah, this had quite a poor ranking in Generation 8 of NUBL, and it has the same ranking in Generation 9 competitive sings. Maybe it deserves to be even lower than this actually, but that's the way it is. Regidrago pretty bad. Up next is Enamorous Therian, who is an interesting looking Pokemon. Some would call it a hideous Pokemon. It couldn't be me though, I wouldn't say something like that. Enamorous Therian is kind of a weird guy. It has good stats, reasonable bulk, high special attack, low speed though, and low speed is the real killer. Enamorous Therian is competing with a lot of offensive fairy types in Generation 9. It doesn't offer that much compared to a lot of them. The ability Overcoat is also pretty average in Gen 9. Not that useful. Enamorous Therian sees occasional use though. Fairy Flying is a great typing. It has unique moveset options compared to some of the other fairy types. Decently OU viable, but its official ranking is RUBL, which is pretty underwhelming for a legendary. Especially these Therian forms tend to be quite good, so this is one of the more underwhelming ones. Up next is Entei, the worst of the legendary beast trio, but not actually that bad compared to some of these other ones. Entei is ranked RU in Gen 9, which I think is impressive considering it was released all the way back in Generation 2. It has some good options like Sacred Fire, a very good physical fire type attack with that extremely powerful 50% burn chance. It's got extreme speed for some priority. It's got good bulk, and it's become quite good in doubles as well. It's seeing good amount of usage in doubles, as Inner Focus is a way better ability now, providing immunity to Intimidate, which is great on a physical attacker. So respect to Entei a little bit. Respect to Entei. Up next, Nihilego. This is actually my favorite of the Ultra Beasts design-wise, both visually and in its in-game traits. I think it's very creative. It's a weird ethereal jellyfish creature. It's rock poison type, and it has a decent stat distribution, good special attack stat, good bulk, and respectable speed. It can use Meteor Beam Power Herb combo to give itself a huge special attack raise while dealing a lot of damage at the same time. It's got decent coverage, but in Gen 7 it was a bit slow for the metagame. Rock Poison not the best defensive typing either. With Beast Boost you can run a spread like this and gain speed on KO, which helps you out and helps you snowball, especially with the Meteor Beam boost, but it's a little bit rough to pull it off. Nihilego ranked UU in Gen 7 and 8, which is decent actually. It's pretty decent, but if it was in Gen 9, which it isn't, I think it would probably be lower tier because Glimora now exists, who has a lot of the same traits. It's also Rock Poison, it's also a special attacker, but Glimora has the way better ability and access to hazards and stuff like that, so I think Glimora would outclass Nihilego in Gen 9. Still a cool Pokemon though. Up next is Raikou, and you gotta give some respect to Raikou. It's a simple Pokemon, just a mono-electric type special attacker with reasonable bulk, good speed of 115. And I think you gotta give some respect to Raikou for being very good in the early generations. In Gen 2, it is firmly ranked in OU and it's one of the best Pokemon in the format. It's top tier. In Gen 3, it is really good in my opinion. It used to be ranked OU fell down to UUBL, but I'm actually quite fond of Raikou recently. I think Raikou can really catch people off guard, and it's a good Pokemon to build around. And in Gen 4, it has some value as well. That's a pretty good early competitive career, in my opinion. In the more recent games, Raikou hasn't held up the best. It's PUBL in Gen 9, and tends to be lower tier in the other more modern games, but I think it's got a respectable career, Raikou. I think you got to give Raikou some props. Up next is Cresselia, who is a pretty interesting Pokemon. It's a mono psychic type with Levitate and fantastic defenses. Really just solid defenses all around, even has pretty good speed considering the bulk. But it's never been great in singles. Debuted in Gen 4 where it is OU viable. It has some merit sometimes. You see it in competitive play occasionally, but suffers from the fact that Moonlight is its only healing move and Sand is always up in Gen 4. That sucks for it. Cresselia was pretty good in Gen 5 for a time on Sun teams, because in Sun, Moonlight heals 75% HP, so Cresselia could be a fantastic Sun synergy Pokemon. And from Gen 6 onwards, obviously Psychic is not the best defensive type to have, because Dark and Ghost types get better and better. Cresselia did have a little bit of 15 minutes of fame in Gen 9, though, with its Calm Mind Stored Power set that was running rampant for a bit with Terra Poison as the defensive Terra type of choice. I'm going to give Cresselia a bit of respect, though, for its consistency in doubles. It's one of the best doubles Pokemon throughout the years, ever since its introduction, because it is just a great Trick Room setter. It's an extremely bulky Trick Room setter, and it's very consistent at setting the meta-defining field effect of Trick Room. Trick Room is fantastic in doubles. And it also helps that Cresselia has some other good doubles utility, like Helping Hand and Ally Switch, and generally good coverage like Ice Beam, which tends to be nice. Moonblast, also pretty good. So yeah, shout out to Cresselia for being one of the best competitive doubles Pokemon throughout the years. Up next is Xurkitree, who is kind of a crazy Pokemon, honestly. I kind of love it. The visual design is frightening. It's some cables come to life, some Christmas lights or something. I like it. I'm with it. And gameplay design, they went a bit insane as well. It has 173 base special attack, which is gargantuan, but then everything else is average, which is interesting. Also has Tail Glow, which is just a comedic joke, really. I mean, do you need more special attack, my friend? I don't know about that. Xurkitree is a reasonably functional breaker in Gen 7 OU, but it is not ranked in OU. It is competing with some other electric types in the format, and obviously the speed and average stats give it some trouble, but I respect it. There was a set with Z Hypnosis, I remember. You use Z Hypnosis, which puts them to sleep and then raises your speed. That was kind of a cheesy way to go with Xurkitree. A bit of fun. And this Pokemon has a lot of problems, and while it's a pretty interesting design, it's also kind of a stupid one. Like, the big special attack and sucks everywhere else. I don't know if that has much legs to stand on. In Gen 9, would this be good? I sort of doubt it. Up next, we've got Fezandipiti, who I'm very familiar with as a TCG player recently. One of the best cards in the game. In the actual game, though, it's a little bit more average. It is kind of a weird Pokemon. It also has the same ability as Munkidori, Toxic Chain, which is a very good ability. And Fezandipiti has a high special defense stat and is kind of a bulky pivot that spreads poison. Beat Up can be used to get a lot of hits in for Toxic Chain. That's something. Poison Fairy actually not a bad defensive typing. That's pretty functional. You got Roost as well for a form of healing, so Fezandipiti is ranked in the RU tier, but can be used in OU on specific niche teams in Gen 9, and it's not a bad choice on them. I think it's an actual interesting Pokemon design, to be honest. Typing we don't see too often. It's a unique set of traits, and it also allows you to draw 3 cards if a Pokemon was knocked out by your opponent last turn in the TCG. That's factoring in. No, it's not. Just kidding. But yeah, interesting Pokemon, Fezandipiti. Up next is Cobalion, and this might seem like a pretty high ranking for Cobalion. This is an average Pokemon all around, right? Debuted in UU back in Gen 5 when it was released, the same as its brother Virizion. But I'm giving Cobalion some respect here because I didn't realize how consistent this Pokemon is. Let's take a look at this. UU back in Gen 5, and it's still UU in Gen 9. That is incredible. You don't see that too often. UU back in Gen 5 usually means by Gen 9 you're nothing. You're down in the depths. Cobalion has maintained a UU ranking for its entire life. It is ranked UU in every single generation. I think that's pretty respectable and consistent, and it kind of makes sense. It's a steel fighting type. It has a good move pool with Stealth Rock, good physical attacking options. It's got Volt Switch as well, I believe, for pivoting. It's typing is quite good, so it just functions in UU in every generation. I think that's pretty respectable. And it's an interesting Pokemon. It's kind of a mirror of Virizion, but it's got the high defense instead of the special defense. I suppose it's just a more functional Pokemon. It's got a better typing that is aged better. It's got the defense is more useful, probably, and I guess Steel type got better with the addition of Fairy type to the game, so that makes sense too. In fact, Cobalion is a rare fighting type neutral to Fairy, which is good. Up next is Ogerpon Cornerstone Mask. Ogerpon is the new legendary from Gen 9 with multiple different forms based on what mask it's holding. And the mask forms will change its typing and its ability, and also the Terrastalize effect. Ogerpon Cornerstone is probably the worst of all the Ogerpon forms, but it's not that bad. It's got a good attack stat. Ivy Cudgel is rock type with this guy, which is a pretty good rock type attack with 100 and high crit rate. And what's good about Ogerpon Cornerstone is its access to Sturdy, which is useful. Makes it a decent aggressive lead, able to set spikes and hit people, and access to knockoff and stuff like that. When this Terrastalizes, it can only Terra Rock and it gains a defense boost. It's not the most useful Terra form for Ogerpon Cornerstone, but it might have some uses here and there. Yeah, okay Pokemon overall. Decent Pokemon. Up next, we've got Ogerpon's base form, and I think Ogerpon's base form is a bit better than the Cornerstone Mask form because it has the ability to hold an item. This Ogerpon form doesn't require a mask item to exist, which allows it to use heavy-duty boots or Focus Sash or whatever else. It's got the ability Defiant, which is pretty decent. If you get intimidated, you get the attack boost. If you get any stat decrease, you get an attack boost, and Ogerpon with the boots can actually function pretty well as an offensive pivot, U-turning around, spreading knockoff, hitting pretty hard with the Ivy Cudgel actually, and this ends up being a pretty good offensive combo here. And you also have Encore, which is a useful move in Gen 9 to punish, King Gambit Sucker Punch, any boosting move, etc. The Terra Grass also boosts the damage of your Ivy Cudgel and gives you a speed boost, and a speed boost is actually quite useful, more useful than the defense boost that Cornerstone Mask gets. Could actually win you the game by allowing you to outrun everything and defeat everything. So I think Ogerpon base form is a pretty good Pokemon, actually. It's UU ranked though in Gen 9, not OU, but has a decent amount of OU viability in my opinion. Up next is Okidogi, a member of the Funny Trio, or whatever these guys are called in Gen 9. It's a poison fighting type, that's a fun typing. It's got the ability Guard Dog, which grants an immunity to Intimidate, and you also get an attack boost if intimidated. You also cannot be forced to switch out by effects like Whirlwind, which is also quite good on a bulk up set like this. Okidogi is ranked in UU in Gen 9, but I think it's reasonably good in OU, and I wouldn't be surprised seeing it rise up in the future actually. I think it's a pretty damn solid Pokemon. As a bulk up sweeper, it's got a fantastic move pool, it's got a good bulk, it has Drain Punch to heal you up, stats are just solid overall. If you want, you can do Toxic Chain too, which is also a good ability. I think Guard Dog's very good though, especially with Landorus Therian on the rise in the format. As a physical check, it's not really going to want to come in on Okidogi that much. I think it's a pretty damn solid and consistent win condition in Gen 9 OU actually. So I would give some respect to this Pokemon. I would give it some respect. Every dog has its day. Up next is Tornadus. It's a mono flying type Pokemon. It's a legendary genie, and in its debut game it was very solid. It has the ability Prankster, granting priority to non-attacking moves, and its stats are pretty good, especially on the offensive side with really good speed and special attack. Tornadus is great in Gen 5 on rain teams because of the stab boosted Hurricane, which is incredibly powerful. Doesn't get that much out of Prankster in singles, but in doubles it has Prankster Tailwind, which is an incredibly powerful tool. For that reason, it's a very consistent Pokemon throughout the years in doubles. In singles though, it has fallen off in recent times. It's a lower tier Pokemon, and it was also ranked UU in its debut game technically. I think that maybe this should be reevaluated though, because I think it's very good in Gen 5 OU, but yeah, by modern standards it's a bit frail, and this speed stat is not as impressive as it once was in modern competitive singles. I really like Tornadus though. It's one of my favorite Pokemon to use in Gen 5 OU. I'm a fan of it. Up next is Terrakion, who was a fantastic Pokemon back in Generation 5 in the Black and White 1 metagame. I remember it being absolutely everywhere back then. In Black and White 2 though, with the release of Landorus Theory into the game, it suffered a little bit in its viability. It was no longer as ubiquitous, but it remains a reasonably prominent member of Gen 5 OU with a solid amount of tournament usage. From Gen 5 onwards, though, it would never achieve OU ranking again. It's UUBL in a couple of generations, but pretty average from then on. It's got a rock fighting type, which I like, and it's got pretty solid offensive stats. The ability Justified, not too useful, but it comes up sometimes, and also a decent offensive move pool with good stab. Terrakion can also be a hazard setting lead with its access to Stealth Rock and Taunt and hard hitting attacks, making it useful after setting the hazards. This Pokemon wouldn't age fantastically though, as Landorus Therian remained a prominent force in competitive throughout the years and really shuts this thing down, honestly. And I think more exciting offensive threats were released over the years that can achieve similar things to Terrakion. But it's a pretty good Pokemon overall. Up next we have Azelf, who had a fantastic debut back in Gen 4. Is a mono psychic type with the ability Levitate, similar to its two brothers in the small floating trio, Uxie and Mesprit, but this one is way more offensive with 125 attack and special attack and a high speed stat. Azelf is probably the best hazard setting lead in Gen 4, or at least the best aggressive one, with its high speed, access to Taunt to deny enemy hazards, Explosion to go out with a bang, keep up momentum early on. You've also got options like Choice Band, U-Turn Azelf, which is another good lead. You have fantastic coverage. Fire Blast and Thunderbolt are great options. And this Pokemon is quite consistent. It was ranked OU back in Gen 4, was also ranked OU back in Gen 6. In Gen 7 it had more competition as an aggressive lead, but I think it's usable there as well, and became worse with the addition of boots to the game in Gen 8, which was kind of a blanket nerf to aggressive leads like this, as Stealth Rock was less of a high reward play early on because of newly introduced hazard immunity. But Azelf has never dipped that low. It's currently ranked RU in Gen 9, which is impressive, I think, for a Pokemon released so long ago, and before that, it was ranked UU in most generations. Also impressive. Up next is Suicune, who I'm giving a bit of legacy value here. Was great in its debut game of Gen 2, a solid bulky water type there, but it really came into its own in Gen 3 with the addition of Calm Mind, turning it into perhaps the most frightening sweeper and late game Pokemon in the format, and a metagame staple for longer than I can even remember. Suicune being broken is a fundamental truth in Gen 3 OU that has stood the test of time, and to this day it's one of the most common Pokemon in high level play. Maintained its relevance in Gen 4 as an OU level threat. Became a bit worse after that, but never dipping that low. It was like UU for a while. I think it's even viable in Gen 6 OU these days. In Gen 9 it's probably bad, but I think that it had a fantastic early performance in the early gens and relative consistency after that, so Suicune has my respect, and it's easy to see why really. Just a mono water typing, Calm Mind, Rest, and Pressure is a good ability on a powerful defensive Pokemon, and its stats are just really solid with great HP defense and special defense. Easy to see why this is so consistent and functional throughout the years. Up next we got Moltres. This is a slightly weird one to evaluate, because currently in Gen 9 it is ranked OU. It's a good Pokemon, but that wasn't always the case. I mean, Moltres has had a rocky career. Back in Gen 1 it wasn't the best. Fire type kinda sucked back then. But to its credit, Moltres is probably the best fire type in Gen 1 in a world where fire types suck, and it's okay there. In Gen 2 it has some value with the Sunny Day Charcoal set, which can break through Snorlax sometimes. In Gen 3, Moltres is straight up just a good Pokemon, with its high special attack, Fire Flying being a good typing here because rocks don't exist yet. Access to Will-O-Wisp was a big deal too, making it difficult to switch in against with enemies like Snorlax and Tyranitar, who can usually come in on special attackers like this, or fire types, and also having a positive matchup against Metagross because you resist Steel, you threaten them super effectively. It's a great breaker there. But of course Moltres would dip off a cliff in Gen 4 when Stealth Rock was introduced. I think it's occasionally seen though in Gen 4, surprisingly, on some niche competitive teams. And in Gen 5 it has a viable role sometimes on rain teams, funnily enough, because it has Stab Hurricane. It hits really hard with that. Not very good though. It's suffering from the rock weakness and water weakness, which is terrible in Gen 5, but still there's something there. Moltres would really have a renaissance when Boots were introduced though in Gen 8, and that allowed Moltres to actually function defensively for the first time in years. Moltres was decent in that gen, and in Gen 9 it's OU ranked, which I think is pretty impressive for a Pokemon released all the way back in Generation 1 to be OU ranked in Gen 9. I think that deserves some respect, I gotta be honest. I mean, with this typing, access to Boots, and the ability Flame Body, which can inflict burn on enemies that make contact. This is a good defensive Pokemon that can also pack a bit of a punch with its naturally high base special attack. And spread status. Status is more scarce in Gen 9, so it makes sense this is a more valuable Pokemon here. I think Moltres is quite good in Gen 9. Up next, we've got Thundurus Therian form, who was a fantastic Pokemon in its debut game. It was ranked OU in Gen 5, and it's one of the scariest Pokemon on Rain teams with its Stab Thunder, that Volt Absorb ability, and some other great options too, like Volt Switch, Focus Blast to hit Tyranitar, and Heatran and other such fellows. Thundurus Therian was excellent. Would never reach such heights again though. It's never ranked OU from Gen 5 onwards. Pretty consistently ranked in UU or UUBL though, so never fell down that far, and it has had some recent relevance in Gen 9. There was a Pinkacross team that used Thundurus Therian as a breaker in Gen 9 OU with Terra Blast flying as an option. That was quite good. It matches up well into like Great Tusk. It's got the Volt Absorb for some defensive entry points, and Terra Blast flying is a very spammable attack with stab on it, so that was quite successful. Not good enough in OU to be ranked in the OU format though, but yeah, solid Pokemon all around throughout the years. Up next, Tapu Bulu, the first Tapu Pokemon here. It's got the ability Grassy Surge, which creates grassy terrain on the field. It is a fairy grass type Pokemon, and in its debut game of Gen 7, this was a good Pokemon. One of my favorite to use, in fact, back in Gen 7. I really appreciate this Pokemon. It's got a big attack stat. I like grassy terrain teams back then. Works well with Kartana and Mega Heracross and Hawlucha and other such fellows. Unfortunately, in Gen 8, it just dropped off a cliff in usage because Rillaboom exists and is overall better with its access to Grassy Glide and U-Turn and such things. Unfortunate news for Tapu Bulu, and this Pokemon doesn't really exist in Gen 9, does it? I think if it did, it would be underwhelming probably. But it did have a strong time in the sun in Gen 7. So I would give it some respect for that. Up next is Thundurus, a Pokemon with quite a good competitive history. This Pokemon was Ubers ranked in its debut game of Gen 5. With rain, permanent rain being a thing, a fast rain threat like this with Stab Thunder was a bit too overwhelming for Gen 5. It maintained relevance in Gen 6 as one of the best special attackers in that format. It is a simple electric flying type with good offensive stats similar to that of Tornadus and a good move pool too. It has options like Prankster Substitute and Prankster Thunderwave as well, to take advantage of Prankster a little bit. It kind of fell off over time though. In Gen 7 here it's ranked UUBL, and I believe in Gen 9 it's ranked in RU. Quite a fall from grace. Uber's ranked once to now RU, but a respectable career for Thundurus, indeed. Up next is Celesteela, who was an absolute menace back in Gen 7 OU. One of the better Ultra Beasts. It's got that classic steel flying typing, which is fantastic. We know Skarmory for that typing, and Celesteela can take advantage of it for excellent upside. It's got pretty good stats, quite modest actually, nothing too insane. It's the typing is doing a lot of the heavy lifting, and it's got a good move pool. It's got access to Leech Seed, options like Flamethrower, Heavy Slam for stab. You can go offensive with Celesteela too if you like, with Automatize, Beast Boost, aggressive sweeper sets. In Gen 8 it kind of fell off because Corviknight was added to the game, who has the same typing. Stats aren't that much worse, and it has Defog and U-Turn, which are generally better utility. If this was in Gen 9, I think it might still be quite good, with Terra existing, bolstering its defensive value, Beast Boost being a good ability, and maybe it'll be effective against all the fairy types. I think it could have potential in Gen 9 if it did exist in Gen 9. Very good Pokemon overall. Kind of an annoying Pokemon though. Never loved facing this back in Gen 7, but can't deny that it was a strong presence. Up next we've got Buzzwole, one of the most ridiculous Pokemon ever made. Big, ginormous, muscular bug. But it was good. It was good in Gen 8 OU especially. It was very good with the Bulky Boots set. This is a Pokemon with excellent defensive bulk, high attack as well, and a great move pool to back it up with the Bulk Up, Drain Punch, and Roost. You've got it all. I think this would be excellent in Gen 9 with Beast Boost, Terra, Bulk Up, Roost, all these fantastic tools. I think that this would thrive in Gen 9 if it existed. We can be thankful that it doesn't. Up next, Latias. Generally the worst of the two Lati twins, but not by much, and when you need a more defensive option on a Pokemon like this, Latias is the one for you. This is a legendary Pokemon from back in Gen 3 that debuted in Ubers, of course, where it was very good back in Gen 3. In Gen 4, Latias was relatively recently unbanned. It was only a couple of years ago that Latias was unbanned and allowed in OU, where it is, unsurprisingly, one of the best Pokemon in Generation 4. Latias has been quite consistent over the years. It has a good Mega form of Mega Latias, In Gen 9, I think it has actually seen some use in OU, with its stored power options and light screen and healing wish. Good amount of utility on it, good bulk. Just a solid Pokemon all around with very good consistency. Not quite the force to be reckoned with it once was, though. In modern games, it's not firmly OU or anything. It's on the cusp. And Dragon Psychic is an unfortunate typing these days. Weakness to Fairy and Dark tends to be a problem. But a respectable Pokemon all around. Up next is Enamorus. Enamorus is a new Genie Pokemon from Legends Arceus, newly available to use in Gen 9 OU, and it's had fantastic success already. It's got the Fairy Flying typing. Unlike the Therian form, though, it is fast and immediately threatening, and it has a great move pool as well. It's got access to Earth Power. This Calm Mind set right here is good. There's also a Choice Scarf set you can use on Enamorus. It has access to the ability Contrary, usually used as Cute Charm though these days because it's mostly a special attacking set. The only thing that benefits from Contrary is Superpower, which you aren't using here, but you can use Superpower if you want a mixed attacking option that also boosts your attack and defense with Contrary. Enamorus can also take advantage of Stellar Terra Blast to gain attack and special attack on every hit as a way to take advantage of Contrary, and it's got Healing Wish to get more value out of it later on in the game, so the Choice Scarf Enamorus can be a good cleaner and sweeper and snowballer. Despite looking kind of gross, it's a good Pokemon that I enjoy the presence of. I think it's a fun offensive threat to use with a lot of cool options, and it's very successful in Gen 9. A respectable member of OU. Up next is Blacephalon, who was a formidable foe in both Gen 7 and 8, ranked in OU. It's a fire ghost type Pokemon, a great offensive combination, and this thing hits like a truck with its massive 151 base special attack. The choice spec set right here is a monstrous breaker that is sometimes just going to tear through your team completely. It's got Beast Boost for Snowball potential too, which usually raises special attack, but you can EV it so that it raises speed instead if you like. I also saw back in the day a set with Flame Charge, which could raise your speed and then you just go to the moon with special attack raises after that. Quite a concept. A very good Pokemon in both Gen 7 and 8. I bet it would also still be good in Gen 9 if it existed. Up next, Ogerpon Wellspring Mask form, which has been a very successful Pokemon in Gen 9 OU as well. Some even think it's too good. They want this banned. I don't know personally, but there's no denying its excellent performance in competitive singles. It's got a Grass Water typing, which is solid defensively. It's got the Water Absorbability, which has a lot of useful application. And it's got the same stats as the other Ogerpon forms, and it can use them well. It's a great win condition Pokemon with the Swords Dance set. You also have like Trailblaze and Spikes and a lot of different options. Spiky Shield. A good amount of moveset variety on this. It's just overall very solid Pokemon that is extremely competitively successful. Up next is Tinglu, one of the Ruinous Quartet and a staple of Gen 9 OU since the very beginning. One of the best bulky hazard setters in the entire game. Also has access to Whirlwind, allowing it to be a form of counterplay against boost sweeping and to shuffle your team around, racking up hazard damage too. Tinglu has just frankly absurd defensive stats, massive HP, massive defense, and the Vessel of Ruin ability lowers the enemy's special attack, which enhances your bulk further too, taking less damage from hits. Great in singles. Very limited move pool though, it just sets hazards. It's got like Earthquake and Ruination. Not many options, no knockoff, no Toxic even, doesn't even get Toxic, but this is enough. You know, hazards are just a powerful thing to do on a defensive Pokemon, so this works well enough, and this is also a good Pokemon in doubles for the field effect that nerfs everything else, and its useful utility, immunity to prankster moves and all that good stuff, and it used to use Fissure. That was a whole thing that was controversial in doubles. Definitely one of the best competitive legendaries of Gen 9 that has seen consistent usage. Up next, Tapu Fini, an overall fantastic competitive Pokemon. A more utility-driven Tapu compared to its brothers, but that was extremely valuable back in the day. With its great defensive stats, great defensive typing of Water Fairy, and the ability Misty Surge, which creates Misty Terrain on the field. And Misty Terrain nullifies all status for grounded Pokemon. Fantastic way to shield your team from sleep moves, burn moves, whatever. All status is just nullified with Misty Terrain on the field. It has so much useful application. It also has Defog, which is just fantastic utility. This was just an incredibly consistent Pokemon to use in Gen 7 and 8 OU. Also great in doubles, shielding you from sleep. It had good doubles attacks like Icy Wind and stuff like that as well. Just a fantastic competitive Pokemon all around. If it was in Gen 9, I think it would be excellent for certain. I think it would be fantastic. Up next, we've got Kartana, the most defining Ultra Beast of Gen 7. Absolutely dominant. This Pokemon is ridiculous. It's got a Grass Steel typing, which is pretty good defensively. And the stats are crazy. 181 base attack is just enormous. And unlike Xurkitree, who has a similarly massive offensive stat, Kartana has other good stats too, with its massive defense and speed, allowing it to seriously take advantage of its powerful attack stat to a great extent. There's Choice Scarf Kartana, which can snowball with Beast Boost. That's the most classic way to use it back in Gen 7, but there was also Z moves. You just destroy them with a big Z move, and then you get the Beast Boost going, and you start snowballing like crazy. There was Swords Dance sets that can also snowball, Choice Band sets, Grassy Terrain synergy, and Kartana absolutely ran the world back in Gen 7. Ridiculous Pokemon. In Gen 8 it was also excellent, at least it can't use Z moves in Gen 8, but still a fantastic Pokemon in OU, and I'm sure the same would be true if it was in Gen 9, especially with Terra existing. It might even be banned to Ubers, to be honest, in Gen 9. It might just be ridiculous if it was allowed. Up next we've got Latios, a Pokemon that I think deserves a pretty high spot here for its level of dominance in its prime. Back in Gen 3, Latios was the best Pokemon in Ubers. Not many people know that. Latios is a better Pokemon in Gen 3 Ubers than Kyogre and Groudon. With Soul Dew and Thunder, it just hit extraordinarily hard, and it happened to be a good check into both Groudon and Kyogre, with its water resistance and ground immunity. So Latios is on pretty much every single Gen 3 Ubers team. It's an auto-include. In Gen 4 Ubers, it's excellent as well. And in Gen 5, it fell down to OU finally, being legal in OU without its Soul Dew item. And it is the best Pokemon in Gen 5 OU as well. A lot of people think it was a mistake to unban it, and they want it banned to this day. And there's valid arguments for that because Latios in Gen 5 OU is also a Pokemon that you can just chuck on any team without thinking, and it will be effective. It's that dominant. The Latios dominance would stop from there though. From Gen 6 onwards, it really fell off with the addition of fairy type to the game, the addition of more powerful dark type attacks with knockoff, the buffing of ghost types, making Dragon Psychic a poorly aged typing, but considering all that, it's still UU in Generation 9. It has viable sets in OU probably. You probably do something with Latios in Gen 9 OU. Relatively good performance in modern games considering how much it was nerfed by mechanical changes, so I would give Latios some respect in that department too. Yeah, just an absolute king back when it was in its prime. Up next, Tapu Lele, another one of the most defining Pokemon in Gen 7 with the Psychic Terrain. Tapu Lele is a monstrous breaker, dealing ridiculous damage with its massive special attack stat boosted by the Psychic Terrain it summons, and Psychic Terrain has immense value on offensive teams, activating Holuch's Psychic Seed, activating Priority Immunity. Everything on the field that's grounded is immune to priority when Psychic Terrain is active, allowing frail offensive threats to absolutely go to town without worrying about getting sucker punched or quick attacked or whatever. This Tapu Lele synergized very well with Mega Alakazam back then, and it was great in doubles too. Psychic Terrain is fantastic in doubles, shielding you from Fake Out and other priority effects, and also boosting your allies. Just a truly metagame defining Pokemon in its debut game, and excellent in Gen 8 as well, despite the terrain nerf. Still fantastic. Now, Tapu Koko, some would say that Tapu Lele should be higher. I feel like Tapu Koko was even better with its electric fairy typing, its massive speed stat, and the incredible electric surge summoning electric terrain on the field. This Pokemon was one of the most consistent things you could use in Gen 7 in my opinion. So strong. Good amount of variety in its moveset too, with physical attacking options, Z moves, Scarf specs. In Gen 8 it could run Boots. It even has Roost on it. Incredibly powerful and consistent Pokemon. Just so fast for how good it is. I mean, 130 base speed on this Pokemon is crazy. Electric Fairy. The Fairy typing gives it so many more defensive entry points. It's just immune to Dragon type attacks, which is nuts. makes any dragon type so scared to lock into anything if Tapu Koko is on the field. So crazy, so powerful. Up next, Heatran, another incredibly consistent competitive Pokemon and a staple ever since its introduction. In Gen 4, this was absolutely everywhere, one of the few things that can withstand the onslaught of Ironhead Jirachi. So great with its Fire Steel typing and ability Flash Fire, which grants fire immunity. That's so useful defensively. It's got a high special attack and reasonable bulk as well. Pretty good speed considering the excellence of the rest of the stats and its move pool and everything. It has Stealth Rock, it's got Taunt, a bit of disruption with Magma Storm and Taunt, allowing you to break through walls and trap them. It's got a great move pool. Earth Power is fantastic coverage. A lot of set variety too. You can go offensive, defensive, Balloon Heatran, Scarf Heatran, everything Heatran. Heatran is everything. It's a wonderful Pokemon. Actually, I didn't realize it was ranked UU in Gen 9. When did this happen? When did that happen? That can't be right. I don't know about all that. Suppose it's not what it once was, but an absolute icon of competitive singles. And it had its time in doubles too, I believe, back in the day. Let's go Heatran. Up next, Tornadus Therian, one of the most consistent competitive legendaries ever. In its debut game of Gen 5, it was ranked in Ubers, just too powerful with this high speed and Stab Hurricane back then. I mean, that makes sense. Is a really fast Pokemon, really hard-hitting Hurricane with Permanent Rain, but from Gen 6 onwards, Permanent Rain no longer exists. That didn't keep Tornadus Therian down. Still an excellent Pokemon all around, with some of the best utility you can get. It's got Regenerator, a truly S-tier ability, restoring a third of its health every time it switches out. It also has U-Turn, and Knockoff, and Defog. It's just all you could ever ask for, folks. It's everything. Defog, such good utility to remove hazards. Knockoff, removing important items. U-Turn, pivoting safely. It also it's just solid all around in the stats. It hits hard with the Hurricane, great on rain teams, even without Permanent Rain in like Gen 7. Tornadus Therian was so good on rain teams for that hard-hitting Hurricane and just as a good defensive pivot of some sort. So consistent, so powerful. Currently in Gen 9, I think it is not currently OU. It did lose Defog in Gen 9, which is regrettable. Still has Knockoff and U-Turn though, and I think it still sees use on certain teams, so hasn't completely fallen off. But just an excellent competitive history for Tornadus Therian. Up next, I've got Regice. This is a ridiculous Pokemon. It's a mono-electric type with the ability Transistor, bonus damage to electric type attacks, and it has the highest speed stat of all time with base 200 speed. And 100 special attack and attack as well. Not bad considering the absurdity of the speed stat. Regice was game-breaking in Generation 9 actually, with Terra allowing it to bypass its greatest weakness, being its lack of coverage. Much like Regidrago, Regice suffers from a similar problem. It doesn't have many attacks besides electric type attacks, making it easily stopped by ground types. But with Terra, you could just use Terra Blast Ice or Water or what have you and get super effective stab boosted coverage that turned Regice into an absolute monster. Some might think that I'm ranking Regice pretty low considering it's an Ubers level threat, but I think that this is a pretty one-dimensional Pokemon overall. It has good utility in Gen 8, but it's not OU ranked in Gen 8. It may be Ubers in Gen 9, but it's specifically because of Terra. And Terra probably won't exist in Gen 10, so I don't think its Uber's status will last long term. Compared to some other Pokemon that have more game-to-game longevity, I don't know if Regice is as good, but I'll give it some respect here for how ridiculously powerful it is in Gen 9. Up next, we've got Landorus Therian, an absolute icon of competitive Pokemon and one of the most consistent Pokemon ever. It's got an excellent typing, Ground Flying, the ability Intimidate, which has seriously stood the test of time. To this day, it's a fantastic ability, and just great stats as well. Massive base attack of 145, and respectable defenses, fantastic typing, and it's always had a great move pool too, ever since its introduction in Gen 5, a fantastic Stealth Rock setter, a fantastic pivot. It can be offensive and defensive, with options like Rocky Helmet to accrue chip damage leftovers for chip healing, or Choice Scarf has been a popular set throughout the years for speed control and pivoting. Great in both doubles and singles alike. In doubles, it has a lot going for it, with Intimidate being so powerful there, and it being so hard-hitting, of course, with that massive base attack. In Gen 9, Landorus Therian got severely nerfed, losing so many of its great options. It lost Knockoff, Toxic, Defog, and I think some more stuff too. But Landorus Therian is holding strong. It has not dropped from OU despite losing all those options, and it has proven to be pretty great in OU actually over time. I think ranking top 10 in usage still. I mean, has any Pokemon had such consistency? Not many can say that they have. From Gen 5 to Gen 9, just fantastic fantastic through and through. And yet I do have one Pokemon higher than it when it comes to OU Superstars, and that is Zapdos. And I think that Zapdos deserves its accolades for being the most consistent competitive Pokemon maybe ever. Released all the way back in Gen 1, where it debuted in OU as a great Pokemon in the Gen 1 metagame. In Gen 2 it was S tier, and it has just been fantastic in almost every single generation since its release, maintaining OU status in Gen 9. There is only one blemish on Zapdos' long career, and that is Gen 5, where it did fall down to UU. In that format, because of Permanent Rain, it was outclassed by Thunderous Therian, who has the same typing and just more to offer, but Zapdos got significantly buffed when it received Defog and then Static, which made it fantastic defensively, and still OU in Gen 9, despite actually losing Defog. Still good just for its electric flying typing, which has aged so well. Still an excellent type combination to this day. Solid stats all around with a great special attack, base 100 speed, everything you want. Good move pool, good enough move pool anyway. Matches up well into Tusker. Good offensive pivot in Gen 9 OU. Up next we have Urshifu Rapid Strike form. Introduced in Gen 8, this Pokemon is incredibly powerful. It has a water fighting typing, great stats, good bulk, attack, and speed, and the ability Unseen Fist, which is a crazy ability, bypassing enemy protection. So the move Protect will just not work against Urshifu Rapid Strike. Pretty damn powerful, if you ask me. This was a staple of Gen 8 OU. It has been great in doubles, where protection is very common, and the bypassing of protection is very relevant. And in Gen 9, Urshifu Rapid Strike is ranked in Ubers. Partially because of Terra, but also because the Pokemon got buffed, receiving Swords Dance in Generation 9. And it has a fantastic move pool, of course, Surging Strikes being a signature attack that always critical hits and is a multi-hit effect of hitting 3 times. Very good move that can bypass defensive boosts too. Stab close combat, Poison Jab is good coverage, U-Turn is fantastic for pivoting. A ridiculously powerful Pokemon, to be honest. Very powerful. Up next we have Ogerpon Hearthflame Mask, the most powerful of the Ogerpon forms. This is a Grass Fire type, which is a excellent offensive combination. To have Stab on both of those types is really good, and you have moves to back it up. Ivy Cudgel becomes Fire type in this form. Power Whip has massive power of 120. You even have Trail Blaze to boost your speed up. You get the same stats as the other Ogerpon forms, but the ability Mold Breaker makes this Swords Dance set even scarier. You can bypass effects like Unaware that ignore boosts. You can blow through, Flash Fire Pokemon with your Fire-type Ivy Cudgel. Heatran won't be able to withstand you. This Pokemon was kind of impossible to answer, actually, in Gen 9 OU, and was incredibly overwhelming. Even without the Terra, just this Mold Breaker set can wall break so effectively. A very offensively threatening Pokemon with a lot going for it. Up next we have Chien-Pao, near the top of the list as one of the most powerful. It's got Dark Ice typing, which is fantastic offensively. It's got the ability Sword of Ruin, which lowers the defense stat of everything on the field except itself. Its stats are incredible, with most notably a fantastic base 135 speed stat, even rivaling many box legendaries in its speed. The attack stat is base 120. It's amplified by the Sword of Ruin ability, lowering the enemy's defense, and of course its move pool is vast. It has myriad Ice Stab and Dark Stab options, and in fact has priority stab options for both types too, with Sucker Punch and Ice Shard at its disposal. It's got Sacred Sword for coverage, Psychic Fangs for coverage, and this was a absolute force to be reckoned with in Gen 9 OU, dominating the format for quite some time. Like I said, put it a bit lower than some stuff above it because it was in OU for a while. It did take some time for it to get banned. It wasn't the first thing banned, so the metagame did exist with Chien-Pao in it for a decent amount of time. It also has the drawback of its terrible defensive typing. Dark Ice sucks defensively, and that can be exploitable. That can be targetable. As for its viability in Ubers, I think it's okay, but it suffers from a poor matchup into Zacian Crown, who is quite common. But the Choice Band Ice Shard is pretty good against all the Dragon types in Ubers. Hits them very hard, so that's something. But there's no doubt that Chien-Pao is absurdly powerful. Up next is Spectria, a ridiculous Pokemon. This is a mono ghost type. It's got the ability Grim Neigh, which is kind of like special attack version of Moxie, gaining special attack on KO, and these stats are through the roof. 145 base special attack is crazy. especially with that amount of speed as well, and even a pretty respectable amount of health. The catch is that Spectria is incredibly one-dimensional. Its move pool is very limited. Mostly it just clicks Shadow Ball. The other coverage option it has is Dark Pulse, and as Will-O-Wisp to at least do something to other switch-ins. You can now use Terra Blast to patch up its coverage issues though, so that makes it better. But that is a point against Spectria, but still, just clicking Shadow Ball with this Pokemon right here is a pretty effective strategy, evidently. Enough for this to be an Uber's level Pokemon. Back in Gen 8, this was outclassed by Calyrex Shadow Rider, the superior form, and in Gen 9, even though Calyrex Shadow Rider is actually banned to Anything Goes, which you would think gives Spectria some value, it's struggling a bit because of the speed tier. I think it ties with Miraidon and Koraidon. Can't quite one-hit them either, and it's threatened by them. The speed doesn't feel that valuable in a world where everything's pretty fast in Gen 9 Ubers. So that's rough for Spectria. I think it could still work though. Will-O-Wisp is a good click, Mono Ghost typing, you can spin block or something. Up next is Urshifu normal form. This one has the same stats as the Rapid Strike form, but it is Dark Fighting type instead, which is a better offensive combination to be honest. And it has the move Wicked Blow, which has 75 power and always critical hits. Also has the same ability as Urshifu Rapid Strike, bypassing protection. And this is a pretty straightforward Pokemon. It selects big buttons and little can be done about it. In this debut game of Gen 8, this was banned to Ubers swiftly. It was incredibly overwhelming. And in Gen 9, they buffed it. They gave it Swords Dance. This was a monster in VGC as well. And it is one of the most powerful wall breakers we have ever seen, to be honest. It is a ridiculous Pokemon. It even has Sucker Punch for priority. Forgot to mention this. It has Sucker Punch for priority. Up next, Chi-Yu. This Pokemon was ridiculous for the brief amount of time it was allowed in OU. This is a Dark Fire type. It's one of the Ruinous Quartet. And it has the ability Beads of Ruin, which lowers special defense by 0.75. And it, similarly to Chien Pao, it is able to select buttons without a care in the world. This has a special attack stat through the roof of base 135, amplified further by the Beads of Ruin ability. It even has respectable bulk, special defense stat of 120. And this typing is way less exploitable than Chien Pao's. It actually has some pretty good defensive merit, and you could use boots sets with a nasty plot. This Pokemon's crazy. This would, with Sun Up, you 2-hit Blissey, I think. There's just no switch into this. There's nothing to be done to it. It's crazy. It's one of the I think it's the strongest special attacker ever, actually. And this was also a great Pokemon in VGC, seen all the time in tournaments, with Beads of Ruin nerfing the enemy and its ridiculous damage output. You would pair this with Flutter Mane and just click buttons. That was powerful, I think. Up next is Naganadel. I mean, you could make the case that Chi-Yu or some of the others are more powerful than this, but I feel like this thing is crazy. This is one of the Ultra Beasts with the ability Beast Boost, the ultimate snowballing ability, allowing you to raise your highest stat if you get a KO. This Pokemon, its stats aren't that great, to be honest, but it's really the Beast Boost snowballing that makes it so crazy. It's got nasty plot. Beast Boost will give it a speed boost if it's got plus speed nature, or a special attack boost if it's got a modest nature, so you can pick and choose. And this can snowball out of control so quickly and just tear apart teams, becoming overwhelming within moments. I think it even had more Uber's viability than the previous entries. It was actually quite good in Ubers. In Gen 9, I think this would be monstrous with Terra. Imagine this with Terra. I don't want to imagine this. I don't want to. And we're reaching the top, folks. The second most powerful of the sub-legendaries, I would say, Pheromosa. Pheromosa was crazy. The most powerful of the Ultra Beasts. It's got that bug fighting typing. It's got the Beast Boost we all know and love. But look at this attack and speed. Ridiculous. This is Deoxys attack come again. 137 attack and special attack, and how much speed? 151 base speed. Just ridiculous. And it also snowballs on top of that, gaining speed on every KO, or you can maneuver the EV spread so that you gain an offensive stat if you prefer, I suppose. Also, it can pivot. Also, it has all the offensive options in the entire world. You have this for ice coverage. You got special attack, ice coverage as well with ice beam. You have so many options. It's insane. Stab options, coverage options, pivoting options. Ridiculous Pokemon. Absurd Pokemon. Definitely a significant cut above all the other Ultra Beasts and most of these sub-legendaries. Most of the sub-legendaries are not on this level of power, but I think this one is. I think this one is crazy. And at the very top of the list, I think that I would give it to this Pokemon right here, Landorus Incarnate. who is a significant cut above all the other sub-legendary Pokemon. Many of these sub-legendaries are just OU level. Many are even worse than that in the lower tiers, but Landorus Incarnate, in its debut game of Gen 5, was an Ubers level threat, and that has been true ever since. This Pokemon is ranked Ubers in every single game, and I think for that reason you gotta give it respect. It has a pretty good amount of relevance throughout the years in the Ubers formats too. Why is it ranked Ubers in every game? Well, it's got that same ground flying typing we know from Landorus Therian, and it's got the ridiculously good offensive ability Sheer Force, which grants 1.3 times power to attacks with secondary effects, while also nullifying the effects. This ability also has the hidden effect of nullifying the recoil damage of Life Orb. So you use Earth Power here, it's boosted by Life Orb and Sheer Force, and then you don't take any recoil. And your offensive stats are this right here. 115 special attack, 125 base attack, and a pretty good speed stat of base 101. Doesn't seem like that high of a special attack stat, but from the Life Orb and Sheer Force boosts on your special moves, it really adds up and your damage output is crazy on this Pokemon. The move pool, quite good too. Earth Power is your general go-to damaging move on this Pokemon, but you've got Rock Slide, which gets the Sheer Force boost too. You lose the flinch chance, but you gain just way more damage on it. Sludge Wave gets boosted by Sheer Force too. You got much more in your move pool to take advantage of Sheer Force and Life Orb as well. And just a consistently powerful Pokemon for many, many years. And that does it for my ranking of all the sub-legendary Pokemon in the franchise. And it's quite an interesting group of Pokemon here, ranging wildly in their viabilities. Just being a legendary doesn't make you viable automatically. Some of these Pokemon are ZU in their debut game. Many of them are consistently terrible, but of course, some of them are OU staples, some of them are even Ubers level threats. A significant amount of power level variety in this particular group, I must say. Who is your favorite of these sub-legendary Pokemon? I think mine would be Heatran. I really love its design and its presence in competitive throughout the years. Great Pokemon, but what about you? Let me know down below in the comments, and thank you for watching.